Funny thing about being arrested for trespassing, especially when you're standing on land your family has owned for 50 years. The first thing I noticed that morning wasn't the police cars. It was the silence of the valley. Out here in northern Colorado, mornings usually start with the soft hum of wind through the pine trees and the distant rumble of pickup trucks heading down the county road. But that day the quiet felt different, like the air itself was holding its breath. Then the flashing lights appeared between the trees. Red and blue reflections danced across the windows of my grandfather's old cedar cabin as 3 patrol cars rolled slowly up my gravel driveway. The tires crunched over the stones 1 careful inch at a time, like they were approaching a crime scene. I set my coffee mug down on the porch railing and watched them arrive. It smelled like fresh pine sap and black coffee, the same way mornings here had smelled since I was a kid. The lead officer stepped out first, adjusting his duty belt while scanning the property. 2 more followed behind him. And then, stepping proudly out of a white Lexus parked just behind the patrol cars, came Linda Whitmore, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Perfect hair, expensive sunglasses, clipboard already tucked under one arm like a badge of authority. She pointed straight at me the moment she saw I was standing on the porch. "That's him," she said loudly enough for the officers to hear. "That's the man trespassing on HOA property." Now that might sound ridiculous to you, considering I was standing on 12 acres my grandfather purchased in 1972, long before this valley filled up with identical beige houses and manicured lawns. But Linda Whitmore had spent the last 6 months convincing half the neighborhood that my little piece of land somehow belonged to the HOA now. According to her, the cabin was an unauthorized structure. The gravel driveway was an unapproved access route, and the land itself, somehow, had become shared community space. The officer walking toward me looked uncomfortable. You could tell he already suspected this situation was more paperwork than crime. Still, procedure is procedure. He stopped at the base of the porch steps and looked up at me with the kind of polite expression officers use when they're not entirely sure why they were called. "Morning, sir," he said. "We received a report that you're trespassing on property owned by the Willow Creek Estates HOA." Behind him, Linda folded her arms and smiled like she'd already won. I could hear the faint electric buzz of cicadas in the trees and the distant hum of traffic about 2 miles down the highway. The valley smelled like sun-warmed wood and mountain air. Home. My home. And yet here were 3 patrol cars and a very confident HOA president insisting I didn't belong here. I took a slow sip of my coffee before answering. "Officer," I said calmly, "before we go any further, have you seen the property deed for this land?" Linda scoffed loudly behind him. "You don't need to show him anything," she snapped. "He's been illegally occupying HOA land for months. I want him removed immediately." The officer glanced back at her, then up at me again. His instincts were clearly telling him something about this situation didn't add up. What Linda Whitmore didn't realize, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that the quiet man she was trying to have arrested in his own driveway wasn't just some stubborn landowner refusing to follow HOA rules. The man she was accusing of trespassing was a federal circuit judge. And if things unfolded the way I suspected they would, Linda Whitmore was about to learn something very important about property law and about the legal authority required to run a homeowners association. The officer studied my face for a moment like he was trying to decide whether this was going to become paperwork or a headache. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. A quiet middle-aged man standing on the porch of an old cabin did not exactly match the image of a criminal trespasser. Meanwhile, Linda Whitmore shifted impatiently on the gravel behind him, her heels clicking against the stones like she was tapping out a victory march. "Officer, this is exactly what I was telling dispatch about," she said, waving her clipboard as if it were official documentation. "He refuses to cooperate with the homeowners association and keeps occupying land that belongs to the community." The word community hung in the air like it was supposed to mean something official. I leaned one shoulder against the porch post and let the morning sun warm the wood beneath my hand. The cabin behind me was nearly 60 years old. My grandfather built most of it himself with timber he hauled down from the hills in a flatbed truck that probably should not have survived the 1970s. I learned how to swing a hammer on this porch, learned how to bait a fishing line down by the creek that runs along the eastern edge of the property. Learned how to read case law sitting at the same kitchen table where my grandmother used to roll pie dough every Sunday afternoon. This land had never belonged to a homeowners association. Back when my grandfather bought these 12 acres, the nearest subdivision was 10 miles away and the road out front was still packed dirt. I remember when the first developers showed up years later with their bright orange survey flags and glossy brochures promising modern living and scenic views. At the time, nobody thought much about it. Progress comes slowly in mountain valleys like this. One house becomes 3. 3 become 20. Before long, the hillsides start filling up with identical rooftops and mailboxes that all match like they came out of the same catalog. That was how Willow Creek Estates appeared almost overnight while I was finishing my law career back east. A neat row of suburban homes built just beyond the edge of my grandfather's property line. They formed their homeowners association the same year the last streetlight went up at the entrance road. For the most part, one ignored it. When I returned here after accepting my federal appointment, the cabin became my weekend refuge from courtrooms and legal briefs. During the week, I presided over hearings in Denver, signing orders and listening to attorneys argue about statutes written decades before some of them were born. Out here, I was just another landowner who liked quiet mornings and the smell of pine trees after a cold night. At least that was the way things were supposed to be. The trouble started about 6 months ago when Linda Whitmore became president of the association. Real estate agents have a particular kind of confidence, the kind that comes from believing paperwork can bend reality if you repeat something often enough. The first letter she sent arrived in a bright white envelope marked with the Willow Creek Estates logo. According to her notice, my driveway violated community access guidelines. 2 weeks later, another letter claimed the cabin itself was located inside newly defined association boundaries. I remember holding that page and laughing quietly to myself at the kitchen counter. It was the kind of mistake that happens when someone reads a map without understanding property law. But Linda Whitmore did not see it as a mistake. To her, it was an opportunity. And standing there that morning beside 3 patrol cars, watching the officers examine the land around them, I had a feeling she believed the situation had finally turned in her favor. The officer remained at the bottom of the porch steps, shifting his weight slightly as he looked around the property. His eyes followed the line of the old split-rail fence that marked the western edge of the land, then moved toward the creek glinting through the trees about 200 yards away. It was the kind of quiet land that did not look like it belonged to a homeowners association. Meanwhile, Linda Whitmore continued speaking as if silence itself offended her. "I have already explained all of this in the complaint," she said sharply, flipping through the pages on her clipboard. "The association approved a boundary adjustment last spring. That cabin is now located inside community property lines." The phrase boundary adjustment sounded official enough that the younger officer near the patrol car began scribbling notes. I could not help noticing how confident Linda sounded when she said it. Confidence like that usually comes from repetition rather than truth. The smell of warm cedar drifted off the cabin siding as the morning sun climbed higher above the ridge. I rested both hands on the porch railing and studied the scene the way I might observe a courtroom before proceedings begin. Years on the federal bench teach you to watch small details. The way someone holds their documents. The way their voice changes when they believe authority is on their side. Linda Whitmore had convinced herself that paperwork alone could redefine 12 acres of private land. The problem was that she had started believing her own story. The first time she showed up here was late last fall. I remember the afternoon clearly because the wind had just started turning cold and the creek carried the smell of snow from higher elevations. Her Lexus rolled up the same gravel driveway, now occupied by patrol cars. She stepped out wearing the same expression she had today, the look of someone who believed they were about to correct a mistake. She introduced herself as president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association and informed me that my property had become part of the community development. According to her explanation, the association had updated its planning documents and discovered that my land fell within a newly recognized shared recreation corridor. I remember the exact phrase because she said it twice while tapping the corner of her clipboard against the porch rail. Shared recreation corridor. Apparently, my grandfather's land had suddenly become a place where homeowners could eventually build walking trails and scenic overlooks. At the time, I simply asked her one question. Did anyone from the association speak with the county clerk before making that change? Her smile tightened just enough to show she did not appreciate the question. She assured me that the homeowners association handled its own internal matters and that property owners within the development were expected to cooperate. When I explained that my land had never been part of the development, she responded with the same calm certainty she showed this morning. According to Linda Whitmore, the association's documents proved otherwise. After that first conversation, the letters started arriving every few weeks. Each envelope carried another notice from the association. Unauthorized land use. Failure to comply with community guidelines. A request to attend a homeowner's meeting regarding my continued occupation of shared land. I kept every letter in a file drawer inside the cabin office. Not because they worried me, but because experience had taught me something important. When people convince themselves they have authority, they eventually take things one step too far. Standing there on the porch while the officers waited for answers, I realized Linda Whitmore believed today was that moment where she finally proved she was right. The only problem was that she had never asked the one question that would have saved her a great deal of embarrassment. She had never checked who actually owned the land she was trying so hard to control. The officer cleared his throat and glanced back toward Linda Whitmore, as if he was hoping she might provide something more concrete than confident accusations. Instead, she stepped forward across the gravel with the kind of determination people have when they believe authority is already on their side. Her heels pressed small sharp dents into the driveway stones while she held up the clipboard like a piece of evidence. "Officer, the association has already documented everything," she said. "We sent him multiple notices. He has ignored every one of them." The younger officer near the patrol car looked up from his notebook. "Sir, did you receive these notices?" I nodded once. "Yes, officer. I received quite a few letters." Linda's smile returned instantly, bright and satisfied, like she had been waiting for that answer. "Exactly," she said quickly. "He knows he is not supposed to be here." The statement hung in the cool mountain air for a moment. A breeze drifted down from the ridge and carried the smell of damp earth and pine needles across the yard. Somewhere down near the creek a bird called once and then went quiet again. The valley had the peaceful stillness that usually comes before hikers start appearing on the trails later in the morning. It was strange how something so calm could now feel like the center of a legal misunderstanding. I watched the officer glance from Linda to the cabin and then back to me again. His instincts were clearly telling him that this situation had more history behind it than a simple trespassing call. Linda Whitmore, however, had already decided the story for everyone. Over the past few months, she had worked very hard to turn this property dispute into a kind of neighborhood campaign. At first, it was just the letters from the homeowners association. Then the emails started circulating among the residents inside Willow Creek Estates. According to one message she sent in January, the land behind the subdivision had been mistakenly occupied for decades and was now being reclaimed for the benefit of the community. She described the cabin as an abandoned structure that was preventing the association from developing a scenic walking trail. A few weeks later, another message appeared on the neighborhood bulletin board near the subdivision entrance. It announced a future project called Willow Creek Nature Path and included a colorful sketch showing a walking trail that curved directly across the exact ground where my porch now stood. I remember seeing that drawing for the first time when I drove past the entrance one evening after returning from court in Denver. The illustration showed happy families strolling through pine trees while sunlight poured across the hills. It was a pleasant image, but the trail ran straight across 12 acres that had never been part of the subdivision. Apparently, Linda Whitmore believed that if the idea sounded good enough, people would stop asking questions about ownership. And to be fair, many of the homeowners believed her. Most of them had moved here recently. They trusted the association documents they were given when they purchased their houses. Very few of them knew the history of this valley before the development appeared. To them, the cabin probably looked like an old structure sitting in the middle of land that could easily belong to the neighborhood. Linda had used that assumption very carefully. By the time spring arrived, she had convinced several residents that reclaiming the land was simply a matter of enforcing the rules. Standing there beside the patrol cars now, she clearly believed the final step had arrived. If the police removed the stubborn landowner from the property, the association could begin its project immediately. What she did not realize was that the entire plan had been built on one very important misunderstanding about the person she was trying so hard to remove. The older officer rested one hand lightly on the wooden porch rail, studying the cabin again as if he were trying to reconcile two very different stories. On one side stood a confident homeowners association president insisting the land belonged to the community. On the other side stood a quiet property owner who had not raised his voice once since the patrol cars arrived. The air smelled like sun-warmed pine bark and fresh coffee, and somewhere above us a breeze stirred the tops of the trees along the ridge. "Sir," the officer said calmly, "do you have any documentation showing that you own this property?" Linda Whitmore immediately leaned forward, clearly expecting the question. "He does not," she said quickly before I could answer. "We have already checked the association maps. The development boundaries changed last year. This cabin sits right inside the recreational corridor." Her confidence was impressive. I would give her that. She had repeated the same explanation so many times that it now sounded like fact, even to her own ears. The younger officer looked uncertain. "Ma'am, do you have the county record of that boundary adjustment?" Linda held up the clipboard again, flipping to a page that showed a brightly colored map printed from the Association Planning Committee. I recognized it immediately. It was the same illustration that had appeared on the subdivision bulletin board beside the walking trail proposal. A green line curved neatly across the paper where someone had drawn the future nature path. The problem was that the map was not an official property record. It was a design sketch. The kind of drawing developers make when they want a project to look appealing before any legal work has actually been done. Linda did not seem to notice the difference. "The association approved it unanimously," she said firmly. "All homeowners voted on the expansion during the February meeting." I watched the officers examine the paper. Their expressions were polite but skeptical. Police officers spend enough time dealing with property disputes to know that homeowners association paperwork does not automatically override county land records. Still, Linda continued pressing forward as if momentum alone would settle the matter. "We tried to resolve this peacefully," she insisted. "We sent him notices, invited him to the meeting, and explained that the land would be used for the benefit of everyone. He refused to cooperate." That part was technically true. I had refused to attend the homeowners meeting she mentioned, not because I was avoiding the conversation, but because the situation had already moved beyond neighborhood discussion. I had quietly spent the previous month reviewing county plats, zoning filings, and the development charter Willow Creek Estates submitted when the subdivision was first approved. I read every page of those records the same way I read a legal brief before a hearing. Slowly, carefully, looking for the detail that everyone else overlooked. And eventually I found it. The association documents Linda relied on were based on a planning proposal filed by the original developer years ago. The proposal suggested a possible trail corridor behind the subdivision if neighboring landowners ever agreed to participate. Suggested was the key word. The proposal was never approved by the county, and no land transfer had ever been recorded, which meant the property lines drawn on Linda Whitmore's colorful map existed only on paper created by the association itself. But standing here this morning, she clearly believed those lines were real. She believed them enough to call the police and accuse the landowner of trespassing. The officer looked up from the clipboard and then back toward the cabin, the gravel driveway, and the quiet stretch of pine forest surrounding the property. "Sir," he said slowly, "before we take any further steps, we are going to need to verify who actually owns this land." Behind him, Linda Whitmore folded her arms with the satisfied posture of someone expecting confirmation any moment now. She believed the documents would support her claim. What she did not realize was that the verification process she had just requested was about to reveal something far more complicated than a simple boundary dispute. The officer nodded slowly after speaking, then stepped a few feet away from the porch and pulled a small radio from his shoulder. He spoke quietly into it while the younger officer continued looking around the property, occasionally glancing toward the tree line and the creek as if measuring the land with his eyes. Linda Whitmore stood beside the patrol car with her arms folded, her confidence still firmly in place. She looked exactly like someone who believed the next few minutes would confirm everything she had been telling the neighborhood for months. The morning sun had climbed higher now, warming the gravel driveway and sending the scent of dust and pine needles drifting through the air. I leaned lightly against the porch rail and watched the scene unfold with the same calm patience I usually reserved for long court hearings. Years in the legal system teach you that truth has a way of revealing itself if you simply allow the process to run its course. The radio crackled faintly as the officer waited for a response from dispatch. While he stood there, Linda stepped forward again, clearly unwilling to let the silence slow the momentum she believed she had built. "Officer, I appreciate you verifying the information," she said, her voice carrying that same confident tone she had used in the homeowners' meetings. "The association has been dealing with this situation for months. Once the trespassing issue is resolved, we can finally begin preparing the land for the trail project." She gestured toward the tree line, as if the future path already existed between the pines. I followed the direction of her hand. The land stretched quiet and undisturbed across the 12 acres my grandfather purchased more than 50 years ago. Tall ponderosa pines stood in uneven rows where the hillside began to slope gently toward the creek. In the early mornings, deer sometimes crossed that clearing on their way down to the water. It was not exactly the kind of landscape that looked like it belonged inside a suburban homeowners association. The older officer returned from the patrol car a moment later, holding a tablet that displayed county property records. He tapped the screen a few times while comparing the information with the map Linda had provided. His brow tightened slightly, the way people react when something they expected to be simple begins to look complicated. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "the county database still shows this parcel as privately owned land outside the Willow Creek Estates development." Linda blinked once, clearly surprised but not yet concerned. "That must be outdated," she replied quickly. "The association approved the boundary update earlier this year." The officer glanced back down at the screen. County property lines do not change without a recorded transfer or official rezoning. His tone remained calm and professional, but the words carried a quiet weight that Linda seemed to miss. She shook her head with a small impatient laugh. "Well, then the county simply has not updated their files yet." I watched the exchange without saying a word. The breeze moved softly through the pine branches above us, making a low whispering sound that filled the pauses between their sentences. Linda Whitmore still believed this was a matter of correcting a paperwork delay. The officers, however, were beginning to realize the situation might involve a misunderstanding far larger than an outdated map. The older officer looked up from the tablet and studied me again, his expression shifting from uncertainty to curiosity. "Sir," he said after a moment, "can you confirm your name for the record?" I set my coffee mug down on the porch railing and stepped forward just enough for the sunlight to fall across the wooden boards beneath my feet. "Michael Carter," I said evenly. The officer typed the name into the tablet. The moment the search results appeared on the screen, his posture changed almost immediately. It was a subtle shift, but unmistakable. He looked up again, this time with a very different expression than before. And for the first time that morning, Linda Whitmore's confident smile began to fade just slightly. The older officer stared at the tablet screen for several seconds longer than necessary, and the silence that followed felt different from the quiet earlier that morning. This was no longer the calm pause of a routine call. This was the kind of silence that happens when someone realizes the situation in front of them is not what it first appeared to be. The breeze continued whispering through the pine branches overhead, while the sunlight reflected off the patrol car windshields and scattered bright flashes across the gravel driveway. The officer slowly lowered the tablet and looked up at me again, his expression noticeably more cautious than before. "Sir, did you say your name was Michael Carter?" he asked carefully. I nodded once. "That is correct." He glanced back down at the tablet, then over at the younger officer standing near the patrol car. The younger officer leaned closer to the screen, reading whatever information had appeared in the county database search. I watched the moment recognition settled across both of their faces. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Years of courtroom experience have taught me to recognize that look instantly. It is the same expression attorneys sometimes get when they realize they have just cited the wrong precedent in front of the judge presiding over their case. Meanwhile, Linda Whitmore was still standing several steps behind them, her arms folded and her posture impatient. She had not yet seen the information on the screen, and her confidence remained firmly intact. "Well," she asked sharply, "does the record confirm the land belongs to the association?" The older officer slowly turned the tablet so the younger officer could finish reading the details. Then he cleared his throat and looked back toward me again. "Sir, just to confirm, You are the Honorable Michael Carter of the United States Circuit Court? The words hung in the warm mountain air for a moment. Linda Whitmore blinked once, clearly confused by the question. I rested both hands lightly on the porch rail and answered in the same calm tone I had used since the patrol cars arrived. Yes, officer. I serve on the Federal Circuit Court in Denver. The reaction was immediate. The younger officer straightened his posture almost instinctively, while the older one lowered the tablet and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Professional respect moves quickly through law enforcement circles when certain titles appear on official records. Behind them, however, Linda Whitmore remained completely still. For several seconds, she said nothing at all. The confidence that had carried her through the entire morning seemed to stall as the meaning of the conversation slowly reached her. Wait, she said finally, her voice losing some of its earlier certainty. What does that have to do with anything? The officer answered before I needed to. Ma'am, he said carefully. According to county records, this parcel of land is privately owned by Judge Carter. Linda shook her head immediately, refusing to accept the explanation. That cannot be right, she insisted. The Homeowners Association voted on the boundary change. The officer kept his voice calm. Homeowners Association votes do not change county property ownership. The breeze moved through the trees again, carrying the soft sound of rustling pine needles across the clearing. For the first time that morning, Linda Whitmore looked around the property with an expression that suggested she was beginning to question the foundation of everything she believed about this situation. But the most important realization had not reached her yet. She had spent months trying to claim authority over land she did not own. And in the process, she had just attempted to have a federal judge removed from his own property. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The quiet valley seemed to stretch wider around us, filled only with the low rustling of pine branches and the distant murmur of water moving through the creek below the hill. Linda Whitmore stood frozen near the patrol car, her confident posture slowly dissolving as the reality of the situation began to settle in. The older officer remained calm, but the tone of the conversation had clearly shifted. This was no longer a dispute about a stubborn resident refusing to follow Homeowners Association rules. This was now a misunderstanding involving official county records and a federal judge standing on his own land. Linda tried to recover her footing quickly, the way people do when they realize the ground beneath them is not as solid as they thought. Well, she said after a moment, forcing a small laugh that sounded more brittle than confident. That may be true, but the association still approved the trail project. The land falls within the community planning corridor. The officer glanced down at the tablet again before answering. Ma'am, a planning corridor is not the same thing as ownership. According to the county records, the property lines have not changed. Linda's eyes moved from the tablet to the tree line and then back toward the porch where I stood. For the first time that morning, she looked uncertain about the story she had been repeating for months. There must be some mistake, she insisted quietly. The homeowners voted on it. I stepped down from the porch slowly, the wood boards creaking once beneath my boots. The gravel crunched softly as I crossed a few feet toward the officers. The sunlight had warmed the driveway now, carrying that dry mineral smell that rises from crushed stone on a clear mountain morning. I kept my voice calm and even. Mrs. Whitmore, Homeowners Association votes cannot transfer property ownership. Land ownership requires a recorded deed or a legal purchase agreement filed with the county clerk. She stared at me for a moment, clearly struggling to process the explanation. Behind her, the younger officer shifted his stance beside the patrol car, while the older one held the tablet steady with the property map still visible on the screen. The boundary lines were simple and clear. The Willow Creek Estate subdivision stopped almost exactly 50 yards from the edge of my driveway. Everything beyond that point belonged to the parcel my grandfather had purchased decades ago. Linda's gaze moved slowly across the clearing again, following the slope of the land toward the creek. The same ground she had imagined turning into a walking trail now looked very different through the lens of official property records. But the association documents show this area as community space, she said weakly. I nodded slightly. Those documents show a proposal created by the original developer. The proposal suggested that neighboring landowners might someday allow a trail connection. It was never approved by the county and no land was ever transferred. The officer glanced at Linda again. which means the association does not have authority over this parcel. The breeze carried another soft rustling sound through the pine trees, and the moment felt almost strangely peaceful despite the tension that had filled the morning. Linda Whitmore looked down at the clipboard still in her hands. The colorful planning map that had seemed so convincing earlier now appeared less like evidence and more like a misunderstanding that had been repeated too many times. Finally, she looked back up toward me, the certainty in her voice completely gone. "So the land has always belonged to you?" she asked quietly. I nodded once. "Yes, it has." The officer tapped the tablet screen and locked the display before slipping it under his arm. The situation had become very clear. And with that clarity came the realization that the call placed earlier that morning had not been about trespassing at all. It had been about a homeowners association attempting to enforce authority it never actually possessed. The quiet that followed felt deeper than the silence earlier that morning. Even the breeze seemed to move more gently through the pine branches above us, as if the valley itself had decided the argument was over. Linda Whitmore stood beside the patrol car looking down at the clipboard still clutched in her hands. The bright planning map that had once looked like proof of authority now appeared strangely small against the wide stretch of land surrounding the cabin. The older officer finally broke the silence. "Ma'am," he said in a calm professional tone, "based on the county records there is no trespassing occurring here. This property belongs to Judge Carter." Linda looked up slowly, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and embarrassment. The certainty that had carried her through months of letters, meetings, and neighborhood announcements had quietly unraveled in a matter of minutes. She opened her mouth as if preparing another argument, but nothing came out. The younger officer closed his notebook and slipped it back into his pocket. The situation that had once sounded urgent over the dispatch radio had become something much simpler. A misunderstanding built on a map that never represented actual ownership. The older officer turned slightly toward me. "Judge Carter, thank you for your patience while we verified the records." I nodded once. "Of course, officer. I understand you were responding to a call." He gave a small respectful nod in return before looking back toward Linda again. "Ma'am, I would recommend that the association consult the county planning office before making any further claims regarding this parcel." His tone remained polite, but the message was clear. Homeowners associations do not have the authority to redraw property lines simply because a vote was taken at a neighborhood meeting. Linda looked across the clearing once more, her eyes moving slowly from the cabin porch to the tree line and down toward the creek glimmering through the sunlight. The same land she had imagined turning into a walking trail now looked exactly what it had always been. Private property. For a long moment she said nothing at all. Then she gave a small stiff nod, turned, and walked back toward her Lexus without another word. The officers returned to their patrol cars soon after. Engines started, gravel shifted beneath the tires, and the flashing red and blue lights faded away as the vehicles rolled slowly back down the long driveway toward the county road. Within a minute the valley returned to its familiar quiet. I stepped back onto the porch and picked up the coffee mug I had set down earlier. The coffee had cooled slightly, but the smell was still rich and comforting in the morning air. Down by the creek, the water continued moving steadily over the stones the same way it had for decades before any homeowners association existed. The land looked exactly the way my grandfather must have seen it when he first stood here in 1972, studying the trees and deciding this would be the place to build a cabin. Some things do not change easily. Property law is one of them. People sometimes believe authority comes from confidence, from meetings, or from the loudest voice in the room. But real authority usually comes from something much quieter. A recorded deed, a line in a county ledger, a piece of paper signed decades earlier that still carries the weight of the law. And that morning, standing on the same porch where I learned to read my first legal textbook, I was reminded of a simple truth that every judge eventually learns. Justice does not need to raise its voice. It only needs the facts,